Like two burdened trains driven on by their own momentum, Taylor's commitment to plural marriage and Congress's commitment to break the Mormon Church raced headlong toward each other. The collision came in the 1880s. Under federal law, polygamy was difficult to prove since there were no public records for plural marriage ceremonies. But in 1882, Congress outlawed illegal cohabitation, making even the suspicion of polygamy sufficient grounds for conviction. Federal informants watched church buildings for signs of marriage ceremonies and conducted round-the-clock surveillance of the homes of Mormon leaders. Scores of polygamists started to go to prison as the result of midnight no-knock raids. In the middle of the crackdown, Church President John Taylor and the upper ranks of church leadership disappear into a Mormon underground.
And from 1885 until his death in 1887, he was completely secluded and did not appear in public at all. He would be in one place for a period of time, and then there was a rumor that the federal deputies were nearby, and so he and his counselor, George Buchanan, and their trusted associates would scurry off to another hiding place.
For John Taylor, it was living outside the law because he felt the law was unjust and that God's law was a higher law.
While John Taylor was on the underground seeking to avoid federal informants, a pivotal moment in the history of plural marriage took place. It was the fall of 1886, and Taylor was holed up in this home in the town of Centerville, north of Salt Lake City. He was secretly visited by three high-ranking authorities of the Mormon Church. They carried a plan to end the practice of polygamy. What happened next is the subject of sharp disagreement. But one thing is certain. In this simple home were sown the seeds of a plural marriage subculture that has endured for more than 100 years. According to witnesses, after listening to the plan to abandon polygamy, Taylor went into a bedroom for the night. The next morning, he announced he had been visited by God and Mormon Church founder Joseph Smith. In the cramped front room, he announces polygamy must be carried on regardless of the cost, and reportedly ordains a group of men with the power to perform plural marriage. Taylor dies the next year, still on the run and still dedicated to polygamy. When Wilford Woodruff assumes church leadership on Taylor's death, he's confronted by an all-out assault on the Mormon Church by the federal government under a new law, the Edmunds-Tucker Act.
The church was in effect put in receivership by the federal government. That had been preceded by the denial of the right of the vote to people believing or practicing polygamy, the denial of the right of immigration for those similarly inclined, the denial of the right of jury duty, and the whole theocratic structure of this religious-based government.
And the Supreme Court upheld the Idaho State Constitution, which disfranchised all members of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, or Mormons.
You have, by 1890, about 1,000 people who've spent a term in prison for practicing plural marriage. You have the church's property being confiscated now under a provision of the Edmunds-Tucker Act.
And then really vicious, you could only describe it as vicious attacks on the Mormon people in regard to polygamy, where you'd have women put in jail until they would testify against husbands, children born in jail, women and children in jail, great personal, almost vindictive persecution of the people in the polygamy cases.
Statehood for Utah would end the repressive federal controls, since Congress's anti-polygamy laws only apply to territories, not states. In the summer of 1890, Woodruff traveled to California in a desperate bid to cut a political deal with National Republican Party leaders.
They had been talking with them about what it would take for Utah to achieve statehood, and of course understood that the only way that that could come about would be for the church to end plural marriage, and for the church to break up its political party, and for the church to stop being the sole prime mover in the economic area.
The world was coming apart for the church, but for Wilford Woodruff, the world had come unhinged in 1890 with the decision of the federal government to confiscate the temples. He saw the church and himself in a desperate position by September 1890.
On the afternoon of September 24, 1890, a press release was sent from Mormon Church headquarters in Salt Lake City to the Associated Press Bureau in Chicago. In the statement, soon known as the Woodruff Manifesto, the church president said he would submit to anti-polygamy laws and would tell his fellow Mormons to do the same.
Well, I've read hundreds of diaries of rank-and-file Mormons, and I think that it's fair to say that rank-and-file Mormons were overwhelmingly stunned by the publication of the manifesto in 1890 that outlawed plural marriage.
I mean, if you believe that a principle is essential for your salvation, no matter what principle it is, and suddenly someone tells you you can't follow that principle any longer, and what do? I mean, you're faced with essentially a conflict that any reasonable person would be disturbed by.
The clouds did not clear overnight, but in 1896, after drafting a state constitution that included a federal directive forever banning polygamy, Utah became the nation's 45th state. But doubtful non-Mormons in Utah refused to accept the Woodruff Manifesto as the final word. The Salt Lake Tribune published a stream of stories recounting rumors of new plural marriages taking place. The church-owned Deseret News fired back with statements from leadership that the Mormons had flatly abandoned the practice of polygamy. Those statements were not true.
Yeah, there's no question about it, because there were members of the First Presidency and of the Council of the 12 who were still marrying people in new plural marriages between 1890 and 1904.
The church officially became involved with continuing plural marriage in that its officers, from the president of the church down through apostles and stake presidents as authorized by the presidency of the church, were sanctioning plural marriages, authorizing plural marriages, performing plural marriages.
In the Mormon missions of Mexico, Anthony Ivins was performing dozens of plural marriages with authority from church headquarters. The unspoken rationale was that Mormons could obey the law of the land by marrying their multiple wives across the border in Mexico or Canada. Mormon Church President Joseph F. Smith, himself a polygamist, was making an earnest effort to keep the principle alive, while simultaneously issuing public statements that polygamy had stopped.
So although he wanted plural marriage to continue and allowed it to continue secretly, he privately gave encouragement only to those he knew were also advocates of plural marriage. To those he knew were questioning plural marriage or were opposed to plural marriage, he expressed disapproval of new plural marriages.
When Mormon Church authority Reed Smoot was selected to serve in the U.S. Senate, Congress used Smoot's confirmation hearings in 1904 to probe post-manifesto polygamy. The hearings dragged on for 3 years and threatened new federal intervention against the Mormon Church.
Joseph F. Smith was very quick to see that his own personal preferences could not be responsible for the destruction of the church. And so he issued the second manifesto in 1904, which effectively closed the door on new plural marriages.
But Congress was suspicious of more promises and demanded tangible evidence. Mormon Apostle John W. Taylor, the son of polygamy defender John Taylor, and Apostle Matthias Cowley became the evidence.
It's unfair for them to be regarded as the only leaders of the church who sanctioned, performed, or entered into plural marriage after the manifesto. They were not, in fact. But they were the ones who were identified in the popular press in that most prominent way. And friendly, as well as unfriendly, government leaders told Joseph F. Smith and other church members, if the church is going to survive, if Reed Smoot is going to survive as senator, you have to get rid of John W. Taylor and Matthias F. Cowley.
Taylor and Cowley became the first Mormons to lose church standing for practicing polygamy after the manifesto. The first, but far from the last. As the Mormon Church steps closer and closer to the mainstream of American society in the early 20th century, a transformation takes place.
When something that fundamental to your faith has been given up, there had to be a great deal of rationalization and soul-searching and trauma in leadership which had rejected the path of the past to a new and I think quite necessary path in the future. And so the people, the Mormon people, to prove their patriotism, to prove their new orthodoxy, came to be rather ferocious prosecutors of fundamentalist polygamous groups.
It's here that the 1886 revelation of polygamy defender John Taylor returns. In the Centerville hideout, Taylor reportedly gave lasting authority to a group of men to keep polygamy alive. They in turn ordained others, so that by the 1930s, a small plural marriage subculture had formed in the West. They considered themselves Mormon fundamentalists, the true followers of church founder Joseph Smith. Church President Heber J. Grant called them renegades.
He had been a polygamist himself, but he was unalterably opposed to the continuation of plural marriage. And there could be no mistaking his opposition. He did everything he could, publicly and privately, to stop the practice, to ferret out those who were promoting